and thank you for joining us today. My name is Young Ki Hong, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E-2 visa options for low investment amounts and high risk E-2 visa cases. And we are very lucky to have our firm's managing partner, Kelly Weiner, as the speaker for this webinar. I will be covering the beginning parts of our presentation, and Kelly will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our work with the E2 visas, and we have built a strong reputation in this area. We have processed hundreds of E2 visas, and many of them are higher risk cases, and have worked with the US consular offices all over the world. One of the particular reasons for this E2 visa focus is that our firm was established on E2 visa by our firm's founder Ian Scott. And that's why we know a lot about the E2 visa world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, a link where you could download the guides with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We definitely encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link where you can sign up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of the presentation. With that, let's get started. So E2 visa is basically based on a treaty agreement between the United States and a foreign country. And currently, United States have signed the agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change. Not that often, but like a few years, a few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from that country. So, for example, let's say you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States yet, but later you immigrant to Canada. Then if you have a Canadian passport right now, then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must have at least 50%, the half of the E2 company's ownership. The corporation type does not really matter, but we usually recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types giving you a very simple and clear supporting document for the ownership point. You could have a business partner, for example, if you are Canadian and your business partner who owns the other half, 50% of a company's ownership, has an Italian passport, then your business partner can also apply for the E2 visa. But you have to make sure that you are able to maintain at least 50% ownership. And this requirement continues when you renew your E2 visa later. So you should consult with the immigration attorney whenever there is any change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is the substantial investment? We'll talk about it in more detail later, but generally speaking, it means the sufficient amounts to make the E2 business fully operational. For example, if your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required fund to establish and start the business are less than, let's say, a manufacturing facility, which requires like $1 million. However, can you claim that your consulting company only need $5,000 to make it fully operational? Not likely. To meet the standard of consular officers and satisfy their review standards, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business type. I'm sure Kelly will address this issue in more detail later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. Okay? The funds must be at risk. It means the wire transfer investment fund must be used and spent. For example, let's say you transferred $100,000 to the E2 business corporate account. Then you need to spend the money, obtain all kind of necessary stuff, including office lease, office equipment, computers, other professional accounting or legal marketing services as well. You will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount out of the $100,000 in your E2 visa applications. The next one is source of funds that should be satisfied. Any legit source can be used, but please keep in mind that government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentation. So you should try hard to keep it simple and easy for the immigration officers to understand how funds were originally originated and came to the E2 business account. Okay. How much is enough? Well, again, we'll talk about it more detail in next slide, but generally speaking, again, we recommend you invest and spend at least $50,000. Typical E2 expenditures. So this bullet point is to show you that how you should spend your investment fund for the E2 visa application. You do not want to spend several $100s for a beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim as a business expense. In real life, yes, you could claim it for a company tax reduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for E2 visa case. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office warehouse rent, marketing, business entity setup, these are the most preferred expenses for your E2 visa case. Next slide. The next requirement, the business cannot be marginal. This is the basically whole point why US government is giving out E2 visas to foreign nationals. E2 visa is supposed to create jobs and contribute to the local economy in the United States. So if your E2 business is barely making incomes to just cover you and your family members' living costs, obviously government would not like it. So therefore, you should keep in mind that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire US employees. You can even hire an employee before you apply for the E2 business, E2 the visa application. Such would actually strengthen your E2 case. So if you think your investment is low, it may be good strategy to hire a US employee before the visa application. Next requirement, business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you submit your E2 visa application, your business must be already fully ready to operate or already up and running by hired US workers. Because you are not authorized to run the business yet, somebody else who, like US citizen workers, can operate the business for you. To prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit a signed commercial lease agreement. Business entity has been established, company website, contracts with the customers or licenses. The next requirement, you will solely develop and direct the E2 business, E2 enterprise. It simply means you are coming to United States only for your E2 business. So your E2 business is basically your full-time job. You should not driving like Uber as a side hustle or just become passive shareholder for your E2 business. You should be actively participating in the E2 business's daily operations. But just one practical tip about this element is that when you submit your E2 visa application to USCIS, they are a little concerned to see if you are actually performing the services without any employees, because such would be like a direct competition against the local labor market. So if you have been running your E2 business too long without any employees, you should consult with an immigration attorney to carefully design and develop your application. The next, you should maintain an intention to return to your home country upon termination of E2, expiration of your E2 visa. Please note that E2 visa is not a green card. It does not automatically lead to green card either. So it only allows you to enter the United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. It does not mean you cannot renew your E2 visa or obtain US permanent residency. You will be able to renew it and eventually go after US green card. But you should carefully develop the green card case direction with an immigration attorney. The next one is a few options for the starting point, your E2 business starting point. You may start your brand new business or buy an existing business, or you could sign into a franchise agreement. If we are considering to buy an existing business, you should consider a business that already has a good number of employees. Because, again, having existing employees before the visa application submission is a really good plus point. Also, you could arrange the escrow consideration in the transaction. This is one exception to the requirement where I said you should have spent enough money before applying for the E2 visa. The contract language in this transaction will say that the transaction money will be held in the escrow account and will be released to seller upon the approval of E2 visa application. And it will also say if the buyer's E2 visa application is denied, then all the purchase price fund will be returned to the buyer. So because the existing business has already everything set up, you do not need to actually spend money to buy like establishment equipment or anything. The purchase price is probably big chunk that you need to pay for to obtain the E2 business. The next slide. How long is the E2 visa valid? It depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months, or it could be long, like 5 years. But even if you get like 3 months of E2 visa only, it does not mean that you will be allowed to run your E2 business only for 3 months. Regardless of the visa validity durations, when you come to United States, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status by CBP officers. And CBP gives you a form called I-94, and which will state that you are authorized stays as E2 status inside the United States for 2 years. So when your E2 visa is already expired, because it's a lot shorter than the given E2 status by CBP, in that case, when you go out from the United States, you will have to reapply your E-2 visa again. Next slide. The regulations do not specifically state the minimum investment amount. As you know, EB-5 requires a minimum investment like $800,000, but E-2 visa does not have such a requirement. This means you could get an approval with even $50,000, depending on the type of business you are applying for. More importantly, you need to show that the amount is enough to make the business fully operational. And that should be looking really reasonable to the immigration officers. And that is why we usually recommend investing at least $50,000 to meet the government officers' review standard. Sometimes the government applies what is called proportionality test. This usually comes like in a very large investment, like $1 million, like for example, pharmaceutical factory. In that case, you do not need to spend like 100% of your investment fund before you apply. But since we are talking about smaller and riskier investment cases today, I would generally say that this proportionality test does not really apply. For the small businesses, it is usually better if you spend 100% or close to 100% of the invested fund before you submit the E-2 visa application. If you are buying a business, you may wonder what counts as a substantial amount of investment fund. Usually it is a fair market value. To find out how much is really fair market value, you may hire a business appraiser or get an evaluation report, but usually it is not required. If your E-2 business E-2 case is kind of weak because your investment amount is small, you may want to strengthen other aspects of your case. We already talked about it, and hiring a US worker before you submit the application is probably one of the best steps you can take. Another thing you can do is to show that your E-2 business already has a strong demand from the potential client or business partners or in the same industry in the United States. A signed contract or MOU or letter of intent from potential clients could also be very useful. Another useful tool is that you can also get a short letter from the local chamber of commerce where your business will be located. Such letter would help you to show that your E-2 business will create jobs and provide value to the community. This kind of support can make a huge difference in the low investment case. Business plan. As you may know, a business plan is one of the required documents in E-2 application. So strong plan shows that showing that your marketing, competitive strategy, your projected revenues, how many employees you plan to hire over the next 5 years. Those strong business plan will definitely also help. And that's why when our firm prepares one for the client, it is usually more than 30 pages and it is designed to strengthen the case and meet the immigration officers' standard review. Another option is a CPA letter. This can be also very useful. This type of letter basically says that the accountant has reviewed the financials of the proposed E-2 business financial projections and startup costs, and based on the CPA's experience, the invested amount is sufficient to operate the business. You could be more creative to strengthen the low investment case, but these are the typical ways we recommend. The next slide. So what are some common E-2 visa expenditures? Basically, this list shows the typical areas where E2 investors spend money and when establishing their E2 companies. Of course, the precise expenses can vary depending on type of business and the models of business you are operating, but this list should give you a general idea of where your investment funds are usually spent. One key point to remember is that while these are generally considered good expenditures, we do not recommend concentrating only a few items. Instead of spending tons of money in just one item or a couple of items, we usually recommend to distribute your E2 investment fund across all different categories that are relevant to your E2 business. Okay. So well, okay, with that in mind, let me turn it over to Kelly, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation, and she will cover how to wisely spend your money to improve your E2 case and how to overcome some common challenges. So please stay tuned.
Thank you, Yankee. So, we have strong expenditures versus weak expenditures. So, strong expenditures are going to be things that are really necessary to get your business up and running. There'll be several things that, many businesses will need, kind of equipment, inventory, office space, insurance, payroll, software, hardware, things like that. And we contrast this with weak expenditures. And weak expenditures we've listed here, these are things that the consulate, really doesn't like to see and that we don't recommend including because if you do include it and they review it, it can kind of make it look like you are trying to bolster the case with expenditures that really are not appropriate for the E2 investment. So one would be kind of travel, airline flights, meals, travel accommodations, hotels, taxis. They really don't want to see things like that. They don't view them as very strong expenditures. If there was a very specific conference that was, essential to your business, you might consider including kind of the entry fee for that, or maybe even the flight, for that. But this should really be very limited in terms of the amount of expenditures that it makes up. For a car, this is, really dependent on your situation. So if the car is being used to, for personal reasons and then also being used, to drive to work, that's a situation where a car is not a strong E2 expense. However, there are circumstances where it could be a strong E2 expense. So let's say you're doing a mobile pet grooming business, so your van that you're using or you have a construction company, and so you need that, that truck, that work truck to kind of, drive your materials around. So a car or a vehicle can sometimes be a strong expense if it's one of those kind of special circumstances. And in those cases, you really want to ideally purchase the car or vehicle. In the name of the company, maybe get commercial insurance. Sometimes there's kind of marketing or branding, or you can wrap the car, with kind of some of your marketing. So it just should be very clear that the car is primarily being used for work purposes and is not kind of a split personal car that you just use to drive to work. Um, the other thing that is not a good expense are kind of expenses paid to related parties. And again, this is not prohibited, but it can make the investment schedule look weaker. Um, and this is the case, for example, let's say that you have a company in Germany that produces websites, and you're setting up a company in the United States, and you own both companies. And you say, well, I'll just have my company in Germany, do the website for my U.S. company, and I'll have my U.S. company pay my German company. Because you own both of these companies, if it comes to light, sometimes names are similar, or the officer might notice that, or might, look it up on the internet. It can, again, it just looks like you're not really putting money at risk. It looks like you are just paying yourself, with money that is your money because you own both companies. This is also the case if, let's say, it's your spouse's company. Again, it may not come to light, but if it does, it can kind of weaken the case and make the officer feel that maybe the other expenditures also need to be, reviewed more closely because they may not be as strong as well. So you really want to focus on, making sure the investment schedule ideally includes strong expenditures. And if you do have any of these, other types of expenditures, that they should not be included or, would be a very small portion of the total, E2 investment. All right, let's talk about some specific challenges for certain types of businesses, starting with consulting businesses. The very common challenge for a consulting business is that a very low startup investment is needed. It's very common for us to have clients, come to us and say, I would love to get the E2, but I want to start a consulting business, and it's just impossible for me to spend, 40, 50, $60,000. There's no way I could do that. And we've worked with many clients to help them, get to the place where they are spending enough to successfully get the visa while also, not throwing money away on things that are not necessary. For the E2 visa, even though theoretically, let's say, a lot of people will come to us and say, I have my knowledge, I have my contacts, I have a laptop. That's all I need. I don't need to spend anything other than that. But for the E2 visa, you do have to demonstrate that you are committed to successfully operating the enterprise by showing that you have placed a substantial amount of capital at risk and it's fully committed to the business, meaning you risk loss, if the business fails. And they really, they're not going to grant kind of a, multi-year, multi-entry work visa without, that proof. So it's important that, money just sitting in a business bank account is not going to be sufficient. It actually has to be committed. Um, Things that you can do to support a lower investment amount. Let's say you only spend 30,000, 40,000. You say you can't spend more than that. You can get things like market research or kind of industry articles that support, how much is a normal startup for this type of business. That can be important to show, Entrepreneur Magazine says you only need $5,000 to start up a consulting business, and I've spent, $35,000. So it's more than sufficient. Um, and you can try to make that argument to the consulate. You do have to consider, spending more money, even though you may not feel that it's strictly necessary, because that is what's necessary for the E2 visa. So sometimes there's a tension between what you would do as an entrepreneur, where you want to kind of be frugal and spend as little as possible, but then there's what you need to do to actually successfully secure the visa. So you do have to wrap your mind around the fact that you will have to spend, a substantial, amount in light of the type of business that you're starting. We generally recommend, again, you want to spend on a wide range of items. So showing that you spent everything necessary for this type of business. Very common expenses will be things like office space, equipment, computers, printers, scanners, laptops, phones. You want to invest in marketing, right? So, how are you going to get your clients, websites, any type of PR campaign that you're going to do. It can be helpful to hire employees. So anything that you pay to the employee before you file can be included. And then any ancillary expenses like a payroll provider or insurance that you pay for, that can also be included. And that's a strong E2 expense. Uh, y- Sorry, can you go back? Yeah. Again, like one thing to consider for a consulting company is if you look ahead a couple years, let's say you do a proposed budget. If you look ahead a couple years, what would you have spent money on? And maybe see if you can pull some of those expenditures, kind of and make them now, right? So maybe you weren't planning to hire someone until year two, but you hire a part-time, office assistant because it will help you increase, your investment amount, and it will also be helpful for you as you're doing the admin of moving your business to the United States. Similarly with marketing, maybe you were going to have a really bare bones website because you're initially going to rely just on your contacts, but maybe you pay for, a better website, or you invest in more marketing campaigns than you normally would have. Similarly, Similarly, employees, office space, you can prepay for office space as well. Some places will let you pay for 6 months or 12 months or beyond. You also might purchase more equipment than you normally would. So that would be something like, additional laptops, additional printers. Maybe you're going to have 4 employees by year 3. Maybe you purchase more of that equipment, up front because that helps raise your investment amount, and you ultimately will need that down the road. All right, we can move to the next slide. All right, so real estate investments. Real estate can have challenges. It's often considered passive. Uh, Purchasing a property and putting it in the name of an LLC does not qualify. So this is something that is on many consular websites. There's kind of an FAQ where it says, you cannot just purchase a property and put it in the name of an LLC. That's not going to be considered a real and operating business that will allow you to get an E-2. So the challenge is to demonstrate, that the company will be real and operating. You are going to do more than just kind of collect rental income or hold the property. And you have to show that employees are going to be needed. So there are some ideas here that different clients have used: real estate brokerages, a property management company, renovation or construction. So these are all things in real estate that could be considered, strong, E-2 companies. You also could do house flipping, but house flipping only works if you're kind of doing it on a large scale, and that will usually require a very high investment. So, for example, we had a client who had a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes that they were rehabilitating and selling, and this required obviously, enough activity, enough investment, enough employees that it could be considered an E-2, but the total investment amount was quite high because of all the money that's needed to do residential or commercial real estate development. Another thing with real estate to consider is that oftentimes it's very regulated. And so, this means that maybe you need a license, for example, if you're going to be, a brokerage firm. And sometimes you can't get that license until you have a social security number. So there are some times where people will need to uh, maybe partner with a local person or even a local company who might have the license that they need until they're able to get that set up. And that can be a successful way to navigate, if you don't actually have a social security number that you can use to get the license at this point in time. All right, so let's look at equity trading companies. These have a lot of similar concerns to consulting. So again, just the concern is this person just doing personal trading, day trading? Are they just doing it for themselves and their family? You really need to show that this is going to go beyond that and be enough to support employees in the United States, and have kind of a real and operating enterprise. It's also, again, similar to real estate, a highly regulated industry. So you have to show that if you're doing certain types of things, let's say you have a hedge fund or something like that, that you have the proper licenses and the proper structure to engage in this type of business. So you want to, make sure that if you are doing this type of business, that when you submit your application, you're making the point to show that the business is not passive and will actually be a real and operating enterprise that has the ability to kind of bring in revenue and sustain employees in the United States. All right, what are some reasons for E-2 denials? So one is, a low investment amount. So while we've talked here about kind of some strategies you can use to explain why your investment might be lower, or to bolster the investment amount, there are some investment amounts that are just too low. So let's say you've only spent $5,000 and you have, $50,000 in the business bank account. The good news about a low investment amount denial is that if you do have the working capital, then it can be a relatively easy thing to fix in the sense that if you are able to go back and make more expenditures, then you can kind of go back to the consulate and say, I have a changed circumstance. I've invested more money, and the case should be approved. We had a client who filed on their own, spent $2,000 and had $98,000 in a business bank account, came to us. We helped them strategically spend up to $50,000, and they ultimately were approved with $50,000 spent and $50,000 in the business bank account. Um, Another might be nature of the business. So again, we've talked about there are some types of businesses that are riskier than others. So, consulting businesses, real estate, equity trading, these are all businesses where going into it, you're going to get some additional questions, that you're going to have some additional concerns about marginality, about real and operating, and you try to address those up front. Another might be filing location. So venue, very important for the E2. Even though the law is the same, the consulates will often interpret what is a substantial amount? There is no dollar figure. So they can interpret this differently. And sometimes, if it's a consulate where they're used to seeing very high dollar, investments from multinational companies, they may be less friendly to kind of the smaller investor who's investing $70,000. Whereas there are some consulates like in Canada, like in the UK, where they're a bit more familiar with and friendlier to these kind of smaller investors. So it is important to know which venue you're filing in and kind of what is going on at that point in time because trends, do change. There are consular officers that will rotate and different ideas at different consulates about what can be considered substantial at various times. So you do want to talk to your attorney and understand what is the landscape at that particular venue at this point in time. Um, the next two reasons are kind of related. So these all speak to the marginality requirement, which is that it has to support more than just the investor and their family. And so if you have a similar business in your home country without employees, then you're not going to be able to to necessarily rely on a business plan in the same way. You really may want to hire somebody before you file. It's not a requirement, but it really might be helpful if you've had a solo consulting business for 10 years, they may not rely on your business plan to believe that you're going to hire anyone in the US. So you really do have to, kind of provide a viable plan or hire employees, before you file. Another might be issues with the adjudicating officer. So, officers are human beings. They have different levels of training and experience, and, they may not, be receptive to your particular type of business. You do want to, if you feel that you got a bad officer, you can always try to reapply. Consulates will try to give you a different officer. They don't guarantee it, but they do try. Another might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people will file and um, they filed on their own or maybe with an attorney that's not as familiar with the E2, and maybe the treaty country national doesn't own 50% of the business. At that point, you would need to kind of revisit the application, make sure you meet the requirements, and then and refile at that time. All right, let's talk about some adjudication trends. Um, and one is going to be approval rates. So government posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. And our approval rate is in the high 90s, but past results do not predict future outcomes, and nobody can guarantee you'll ever get, your visa. That being said, the E2 has been one that has very high approval rates. Timelines. So in London right now, timing for E2s is several months. They're taking about 90 business days to review cases. And then once you are called for your interview, you can usually get an interview within a few weeks. But the 90 business days, it's not a guarantee. Sometimes it takes longer. So you do want to plan in advance. In Toronto, they're generally reviewing it about 15 to 20 business days. And then appointments are usually available 1 to 2 months after that. It used to be faster in Toronto. There used to be, more appointment availability, but this does fluctuate. And so there's busy times, for example, the summers, around the holidays, so this is kind of a moving target. But when you're thinking about your time scale for applying, you want to think in kind of months as opposed to days or weeks. Generally, processing times are really all over the place. But even the fastest ones are usually, a few weeks. And then you're able to schedule your appointment, ideally within a month after that. So USCIS versus the consulate. If you are applying for an E2, then you can potentially apply for a change of status with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services as opposed to applying for a visa at the consulate. The change of status is only available to people who are already in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change your status. Um, So, for example, let's say you've entered on a B1 to investigate your, the E2 opportunities, and you want to change your status, or you're here on an H1B and you want to leave your job and, start up a company. You could do a change of status. It's important to note you won't get a visa, so it doesn't allow you to travel internationally. If you apply with USCIS, you will get a 2-year approval notice that gives you a new I-94 under the E2 and allows you to kind of live and work in the United States at the E2 business. If you leave the US, so let's say 1 year into your approval, you leave the US, you would have to apply for the E2 at a consulate, and they will not rely on the USCIS approval. They will look at it as a brand new case. So there are some visas where once you get a USCIS approval, like an H or an L, you go to the consulate and they will rely on the substantive approval. That's not the case for the E2. So for some people, if they like to travel, the USCIS change of status is not a good option. USCIS also takes a very strict approach to the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex source or trail of funds, it can be a difficult option. That being said, USCIS is more receptive to lower investment amounts than many consulates are. So, we've had clients where the business, where it makes sense in light of the business, maybe they have an investment around 35, 40,000, and sometimes that will work, with USCIS, where that would be quite difficult at a consulate. Moving to consular filings, I'd say the majority of applicants will take this route if they're able to get a multi-year, multi-entry visa. So, for example, if you're a Canadian national, you can get a 5-year multiple entry visa for the E2. So that's often a more attractive option, than just a 2-year change of status. Every time you enter on your visa, you'll get 2 years in E2 status, but you can kind of come in and out freely for that 5-year period. Um, Additionally, consulates will often take a more high level view of the source and trail of funds. So that can be, favorable if, it would be difficult for you to track, every dollar the way that USCIS requires. You want to think about kind of post specific considerations. That means, each consulate kind of has their own method, their own procedure, their own way they want the submissions done. So you can't assume it will be similar across consulates. You do want to look on the website. Do they have specific instructions? Many have, file size limitations, page limits, certain things that they want, ways they want it submitted. In Germany, they want, both an email filing and a paper filing. So it can be very specific. And you want to make sure you've checked into that. You also want to understand what are the consular preferences. So as I mentioned earlier, consulates will have their own ideas about what counts, as substantial investment. And so you want to know kind of what is, there's sometimes some consulates will ask for certain tax documents that are, specific to that particular country. So you do want to be aware of that in advance. Um, there are also some consulates that require that a CPA certifies your business plan. Singapore and Mexico come to mind, but this is kind of a moving target. This can change, but they will say we want a 5-year business plan and we want the financial statements validated by a CPA. So you do want to, kind of keep that in mind when you're hiring your business plan writer. We do offer the service of drafting business plans, and we do actually have a CPA, on staff who can, assist with that. But it is important to know that whatever business plan writer you hire, or if you do it yourself, that you plan for that CPA certification if the consulate you're applying at requires it. All right, so moving to some issues in complex areas, do you have to hire employees before you apply for an E2? Uh, no, you do not. So you do not have to hire employees. It is not a requirement. And it can be helpful. So there are circumstances we've talked about here where it would be very helpful to your case, but it's not a requirement. And there are some consulates that will say it's a requirement, that the business already has to be real and operating. That is not the case, but there are some times where consulates will take that position. And that's usually where the consulate is used to seeing purchases of businesses or larger multinational businesses that are bringing over E2 employees. So a complicated source and trail of funds for USCIS filings, loans, gifts. Loans are permitted as long as they are either unsecured or secured on the investor's personal assets. Um, Gifts are also permitted, but you will have to show where the gift giver got the money. So if you're going to get a gift, you want to make sure in advance that the gift giver is comfortable giving you their financial documentation, because a gift letter alone would not be enough. They will need to share if it's they sold a property, they'll need to show, the proof of that. If it's their tax returns from personal savings, they'll need to be comfortable sharing their tax returns. So E2 visas are available for, to investors, but you have to own it 50-50. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So there's times where people will think, well, I have a multiple year visa and I can work in the United States. And the E2 is more restrictive than that. You are not permitted to just work anywhere. You can work for the business that you were approved for. And so sometimes people will start up, say, well, I had my one company and I started up another company. So you need to get an approval before you do that. You cannot just open multiple companies. Again, your E2 visa allows you to work for your E2 company and it is company specific. Additionally, a change in ownership. So if you've gone below, 50%, that can be a major problem for qualifying for the E2 visa. So if you're 2.5 years into your visa and you sold your majority share of your company, you are technically no longer maintaining your status at that point, even if you have a valid visa. And it changes into the type of business. If there's a major change to the business, like instead of running a restaurant, now you want to open a photography business, that needs to get an approval first. You cannot just completely change what the business is doing. That being said, if you are, either following your business plan, so let's say your business plan contemplated IT consulting and then doing a mobile app development in year 3, that would be fine, because that's something that you've contemplated and explained to the consulate. But major changes should be discussed with your attorney before you make them to make sure you're not accidentally violating your status. Family business purchases. This is, something that can work, but it's going to have extra scrutiny on it. And so that means that, if you are purchasing a business from a family member, you want to make sure that the purchase price makes sense in light of the type of business that you're starting. And you also want to maybe get a valuation or some type of objective, like maybe having a CPA look at the financials and writing a letter explaining, yes, this is the fair market value for this business, because they may have more questions about it when it's not an arm's length transaction. So the impact of the current administration. So there have been many executive orders, related to immigration, none specifically on the E2, but there's many that have impacted the E2. So there's kind of generally focus on enhanced vetting. There's also, and kind of screening. There are certain kind of countries that are, kind of banned. So there is a lot that's happening that even though the E2 is not specifically, mentioned in the executive orders, there's a lot that is impacting, E2 visa holders as these kind of additional vetting and screening procedures are put in place. And you can kind of expect longer wait times. Policies have changed, like, interview waivers. So, the people over 79 or under 14 used to not have to attend visa interviews. Those were waived. Those are no longer waived. So even if you have a baby who's applying for the E2 with you, unfortunately, you now need to bring your baby to the interview. Um, there's higher investment and higher employee numbers. That's always going to look better, whatever administration it's in, but especially in this administration when they're doing more intense vetting, you really want to think about, how do I make this case as strong as possible? Can I invest more? Because the purpose of the E2 program is, to encourage economic, benefit between the US and the treaty country. As much as possible, you want to make your investments in the United States. So if you have the option to buy a laptop in Canada or a laptop in the US, you want to purchase it in the US. Similarly, if you're hiring contractors to help you with things, really think about doing it in the US instead of abroad. It's not a requirement, but it does help. We do note, though, that approval rates for E2s did not change much from 2016 to 2020. E2s are still regularly getting approved, but there is this enhanced vetting to consider.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. That was a very helpful presentation. And with that, let's go ahead and take a look at questions. Okay. Okay, we do not have any questions. In that case, thank you all for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful to plan your E2 visa application. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit our website and schedule a consultation with our team. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.